for our audiences who might not be so familiar with Sobukwe and what he represents not only to South African history, but generally continental history, in the 20th century in South Africa, there are these towering figures. There's Luthuli, Mandela, there's Biko, as you just mentioned. And the way you put it just now is that Sobukwe was Biko before Biko. So can you, for the benefit of our audiences, just place Sobukwe in that political tradition in relation to the Pan-Africanist Congress as well, which is the movement that he founded?
Great. Okay, so let's see if we can do this very quickly. One of the points that really drew me to Sobukwe is how much Sobukwe has been forgotten. So there's a couple of historical moments which sometimes strike us as, really? Are you serious? And one of those was the fact that in the early 1960s, Sobukwe was seen by many Africanists, many Africans across the continent, as much more of a promising hope for some kind of revolution or fundamental post-colonial state and post-colonial vision of Africa and of Azania, of South Africa, than was Mandela. So it's just important to remember that, I think, that as a whole series of decolonization movements were sweeping across Africa, which is also importantly the context for when Sobukwe speaks about a genuinely Pan-Africanist vision. This is very different in many of its expressions and many of its instances of radicalism from something like the Freedom Charter, from something like a more moderate direction where the ANC was going at that time. So if you go back even to 1952, you start to find that the young Sobukwe, I think it's in 48 that he joins the ANC. He's part of the ANC Youth League. He's very inspired, very passionate by all of this, but very quickly it becomes apparent to him that the more moderate attempts within the ANC, who's seeking some kind of collaborations, who's seeking some kind of political relationships, particularly with white liberals, for example, is not the way he wants to go. He thinks, and that's why I say in some respects he's the Biko before Biko, because for him, such a political attempt, as useful as it may have been to create various allegiances and so on and so forth, is inevitably going to be watered down by white liberals, right? Who are going to bring some political idea, but they're going to have a kind of integrationist agenda. And for Sobukwe, this becomes a problem because the more there's a kind of integrationist agenda that's set by white liberals, the more it's going to favor them. And what that is ultimately not going to deliver is the fact that the people who most need Africa, who belong in Africa, and who need to speak and whose needs need to be met are Africans themselves. Hence, the revolution, so to speak, must be by Africans for Africans. That whole very pro-Africanist discourse is something which doesn't come through so strongly in other facets of the ANC at that time. So there's a break with the ANC. Sobukwe then goes on to lead the Pan-Africanist Congress, who is not willing to kind of take a slower, more integrationist approach. And thus we see the kind of billiard balls of history, because on 21st of March 1960, there's the campaign, the anti-pass campaign. Sobukwe calls it the Positive Action Campaign. And he mobilizes thousands of Africans to go and hand in their passbooks or be deliberately arrested in an attempt that will thus absolutely overflow the system. The South African police force will not be able to deal with this. And there's a demonstration thus that the system is unsustainable and inequitable and oppressive. And interestingly, actually, looking over the book before the interview, I see that I included a letter that he sent to the South African Minister of Justice or Police before, saying, this is what we're going to do. Do not open fire on us. This is exactly what we're going to do. We are peacefully going to submit to arrest. That's the nature of this campaign, but do not open fire on us. And of course, that's exactly what happens on the 21st of March, 1960 in Sharpeville. We have at least 69 people dead. And from that point, Sobukwe is imprisoned. The ANC is banned. The PAC is banned. And that's actually, in many respects, where the book begins for those years of his imprisonment. So that was a little brief, but I hope
that was good. That was good. That was good.
That was tremendously comprehensive, and we appreciate it. To ask a follow-up question, and we want to talk about the book and the letters and what Sobukwe articulates himself through there, but I'm curious to hear, as far as you understand it, what is Sobukwe's idea of an African? Because I think this is something that is often a very contested concept, whether it's some people who say that Sobukwe had a more kind of ethno-racialist definition of being an African, which is that people who originate from the continent of Africa, or was it this other more substantive vision of being an African, which is being committed to the liberation of the African continent and its people, and that's something that someone can subscribe to regardless of their origin? How do you understand what it meant to be an African?
And just to add to that, I think in the book, for example, when he writes to Benjamin Pogren, at one point, I think he just sort of matter-of-factly says something like, as one African to another. It's in a letter, I think, about books, but he just kind of drops that. So can you just say a little bit about his understanding of African?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little odd, I suppose for me to be, reflecting on this, although then again, maybe not. But I think the way to answer your question is, as far as I understand Sobukwe's approach here, he says, if you are an African, if you live in Africa, if you pay allegiance to Africa, and if you willingly endorse an African majority rule. And he also then has a kind of semi-definition of what it means to be not African. And I think this is sometimes forgotten. So let's remember this as well. For Sobukwe, you can have been born in and live in Africa and not be African as well, right? So let's just bear that in mind. Because sometimes I think you're alluding to some of these debates whereby people say, well, despite that I'm white, I was born, I've lived my whole life, several generations, therefore I'm by definition an African. Well, yeah, maybe. But according to Sobukwe, you need to fundamentally have that allegiance. In other words, Africa comes first in your political allegiances and in your national allegiances. It's the place that you are living in, the place that you are committed to, the place that you would exercise some fidelity to above and beyond any other nation, right? Africa itself. And fundamentally, it also means being, as he's put it, willing to endorse and live with African majority rule, which is, obviously a qualification of his times. But those terms that he offers are still fairly illustrative, fairly useful for us, I think, because, it makes a case in point. I could, for example, claim, yeah, I'm an African, but then you just ask, like, Eric, well, where do you live? And, what is the passport that you hold? And then suddenly you become aware that opportunistic attempts to claim my Africanness as a white person, for example, may not actually be as justified as I would like to believe that they are.
So I'll just mention this, and I wanted to ask a question about sort of the stuff that he's writing about in the letters. Like, one thing I think that's striking just on this point, you note that he actually maintains a number of close relationships with whites. I think that there's a way in which the PAC later gets written about that it's anti-white, but I think it's fascinating that Sobukwe's the most personal collaborator, if you want. It's like Benjamin Pogren. Like, they write to each other about marriage. I think at one point he's counseling Pogren about divorce. I've noticed that. But Eulalie Stott, who's a Cape Town city councillor,